Hello, this is Ashutosh Varshne, and this video is based on my recent column for ThePrint, and the topic is President Donald Trump's tariff war in general, but especially the with respect to India. When Trump returned to power, Prime Minister Modi had celebrated essentially his return, fondly remembering their friendship in the first term, and Prime Minister Modi, of course, expected that this earlier friendship would continue and would yield benefits to India. India-US relationship, however, has entered a very rocky phase. So there are two important questions which we need to look at. First, what is the logic underlying Trump's tariffs? And second, what are India's options? The standard rationale for tariffs is economic. To protect domestic industry, tariffs have often been used by nations, and it is behind tariff walls that the United States industrialized in the late 19th century. And steel, for example, all of America's steel, which was the centerpiece of the original phase of industrialization in Europe and elsewhere, all of America's steel in 1860 came from Europe and especially Britain. And by 1900, and between 1900 and 1905, American steel was being exported to Europe, and America had ceased to be a steel importing country. And this 40-year period of tariff protection led to the birth of American steel industry and its rise. Japan and South Korean steel industry also rose similarly. Tariffs fell out of fashion during the era of globalization that began in the 1980s, and economic policymakers and increasingly political leaders also came to believe that tariffs, by stifling competition, created inefficiencies and retarded economic growth. It's not that tariffs have not been used. They've been used to promote industrialization, and there are also clearly examples when they hindered industrialization by stifling competition. Trump's tariffs, however, are surprising in two ways. They're different in two ways. First, it is developing countries that have mostly used tariffs to promote industrialization. South Korea did that successfully in the 1960s and 70s, as did, of course, the United States after 1860, 1865, when the United States was actually a developing country. It became a very rich country only by 1905, 1910. Economically developing countries generally don't use tariff walls to speed up industrialization. They typically use some industry-specific subsidies, not an all-round comprehensive construction of tariff walls. So that's one reason Trump's tariffs are different. And the second, of course, during the era of globalization, the world had forgotten how to use tariffs for political purposes. They've been used politically in modern times and modern history. For example, in 1840s and 1850s, East India Company, headquartered in India, used tariff war, in fact, opium wars to open up Chinese markets for opium exports from Bengal. Now, Trump's tariffs are not about wars yet, certainly, but they raise the important question of whether tariffs can be used for political purposes. A classic of political science, Power and Interdependence, a book called Power and Interdependence, um, written by Robert Cohen and Joseph Nye, who died recently, some 50 years ago, has the best answers to the question of whether tariffs can be and have been can be used politically, and what would be the logic underlying a political use of tariffs. So Cohen and Nye recently summarized the book in an article in Foreign Affairs, and they said the following: the paradox of trade power is that success in trading relationships is a source of vulnerability. Meaning what? Meaning that running a trade deficit can strengthen a country's bargaining position because the deficit country can impose tariffs on the surplus country. Surplus country would not benefit from these tariffs, but the would not have much bargaining power, but the deficit country certainly can have bargaining power, especially if its market is large. So, in light of this argument, let us examine Trump's tariffs and especially the Indo-US trade relationship. In 2024, India-US goods trade was valued at $129 billion. India's exports to the United States were worth $87.4 billion, and the imports from the US to India were worth $42 billion. In other words, India enjoyed a surplus of 46 billion, and the United States had a deficit of 46 billion in its trade with India. India, of course, is not even among the 10 largest trading partners of the United States. The four largest are Canada, Mexico, China, and the European Union. All have faced, not just India, all of these very large trading partners enjoying surplus, trade surplus with the United States, have faced Trump's tariffs, and with the exception of China, all have had to make a compromise or are well on the way to making one. These trade surplus economies depend on US markets much more than the US does on their markets. So, can India follow China and take on the US? That is a very important um, practical question right now. Despite its surplus vis-a-vis the United States, China can partially deviate from the trade vulnerability that Cohen and Nye have pointed out because it has virtually irreplaceable control over some precious minerals called rare earths today. Rare earths are absolutely critical to the development of newer technologies today. In India's export bundle to the US, there is nothing that is irreplaceable, nothing at all. So India's trade surplus, creates trade vulnerability, makes India weaker in its bargaining with the United States. Secondly, in terms of balance of power, the management of India's adversarial relationship with China also requires US support. In the past, Soviet support helped India manage its security environment. But today, Russia is a successor state to the Soviet Union, the principal successor state to the Soviet Union, is much weaker than what Soviet Union was in the 1960s and 70s. Moreover, to counter the West, including the United States, Russia is also seeking an alliance with China today. So, if in the era of liberalization over the last 3.5 or 4 decades, India had economically and militarily grown as rapidly as China, there would be no need for India to cultivate the United States and seek its support. And India could have stood on its own feet. But India is far behind China economically and militarily. And to counter China And to manage its larger security environment, India needs powerful allies like the United States. Power politics drives and is driving Trump's foreign and economic policy. Interests defined by Washington as American interests, not larger principles of democracy, form the basis of America's bilateral relationships under Trump. Both adversaries and the so called allies in Western Europe, Japan, South Korea, all have been subjected to the same master narrative of power politics, some enjoying greater benefits, some enjoying less, but all under a tariff regime. Unless the United States courts force Mr. Trump to drop executive construction of tariff policy and push it to towards the legislature, towards US Congress, or the MAGA base of President Trump is hurt by his tariffs. Unless those two things happen and they change, they loosen his control over tariffs, India will have to develop a response which, in terms of power politics, is born out of an imbalance of power. There are very few good options, very, very few. India will have to go for a trade deal of some kind, which, based on an imbalance of power, there does not appear to be a very good, an ideal way out. Um, thank you, and I'll see you in 2 weeks when I present my next column.